Okay. So yeah, good afternoon again, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this Birmingham Heritage Week talk. Over the course of the next hour or so, just under an hour, I am going to be discussing Birmingham's role in the early origins of the World Snooker Championship, and aim to shed some light on the significance of the city in the story of professional snooker. As I've already stated, I'm going to leave a few minutes at the end of the hour for any questions or queries, but without further ado, let's begin. So firstly, to introduce myself, my name is Thomas Bartley. I am an undergraduate history student at the University of Warwick, and as part of my degree, I was invited to make a proposal for a funded summer research project. Now, I enjoy my degree a lot. It's very stimulating and challenging, and we get to cover lots of interesting things. But I knew that this project, part of a programme called the Undergraduate Research Support Scheme, presented new opportunities. And so I was keen to explore something within it, which was a little bit off the beaten track. This brings me to today's talk. Last September, I was listening to a podcast about one of my favourite sports, the Snooker Scene podcast. On that, the presenter, Dave Hendon, embarked on a mini snooker tour of Birmingham, taking in some of the locations in the city which had played a part in the game's history. This included the old Pebble Mill Studios, pictured here, a place which I should imagine some of you will be very familiar with, where snooker TV programme Pot Black was filmed, as well as the Royal British Legion in Selly Park, which hosted the 1972 World Snooker Championship, famous for featuring Alex the Hurricane Higgins' first world title win. But it was another tale which caught my eye, or my ears in this case, that of John Bright Street, which played host to the first World Snooker Championship final back in 1927. I was quite astonished. I knew nothing of Birmingham's role in helping to launch the competition, especially not that the tournament had begun on a street I had walked past countless times before. And so began, really, the seeds of my project, an interest in finding out more about this place. Now, those of you watching this talk who have ever dabbled in some amateur research yourselves will know that the starting is always the hardest thing. And I could tell from my initial Google searches and inquiries that that was definitely going to be the case with this topic. Snooker, whilst certainly popular, is not as well served on the history and archival front as other sports such as football, rugby and cricket. In addition to this, the 1927 event was pretty small by our present day standards and did not command as much public interest as the tournament does today. But, determined nonetheless, I made the application for my project and was successful. And earlier this year, I began my research. The words World Snooker Championship no doubt elicit a range of different reactions amongst people. For some, it is a 17-day fest of sport, which takes you from Easter to the early May bank holiday with high drama and tension. For others, it might mean time to switch the TV over, perhaps forever associated with boring afternoons or evenings in front of the box. But whichever side of that coin you find yourselves on, there is one thing which means snooker more than any other. It is Sheffield's Crucible Theatre, the Colosseum for all this action and host for the last 47 World Championships. By day, this relatively small theatre hosts excellent plays and shows from some of the country's cleverest writers and best actors. But for just over 2 weeks, there is really just one show in town, as the World Championship engulfs Sheffield and all in it. The perfect place, I concluded, to start my research. How else can I get a sense for what this tournament means and what its participants know about its history? As far as the first part of that question is concerned, the answer was clearly everything. This is the one everyone wants to win and the one people enjoy most by a country mile. There were signs of the tournament's presence right across the city, and curious onlookers even filled the nearby Winter Gardens to watch the BBC TV production take place. Everyone is aware that the Crucible has a reach way beyond conventional snooker tournaments, and even beyond snooker itself. As for the second part of my question, more people drew blanks. Pros like Jack Lazowski and Robert Milkins that I spoke to could tell me little about the event's beginnings, and certainly no one knew how the World Championship came to begin in Birmingham. I therefore left Sheffield imbued with a sense of the competition's value, but little clearer as to how the seeds of this wonderful tournament had been sown in the first place. So it was now time to turn back the clock. 96 years to May 1927, a time when millions each year were not captivated by snooker. George V was on the throne, Stanley Baldwin was in number 10, and the first non-stop transatlantic flight was just about to be piloted by Charles Lindbergh. And crucially to our story, in a small snooker and billiards hall in the centre of Birmingham, the first World Snooker Championship final was just about to take place. The staging of this first World Snooker Final, or Professional Snooker Championship Final, as it was known then, was a significant moment. The history of the sport itself was still pretty short by this point. The conventional story about snooker's creation begins in Jabalpur, formerly known as Jubalpur, India, in 1875. A young Colonel Sir Neville Chamberlain, note not that Neville Chamberlain, nor a member of the famous Birmingham family, was the pioneer, adding coloured balls to a black pool game popular amongst stationed officers. Not too revolutionary a story on first glance, it has to be said. At that point, there was no sense that this was a game which would soon become one of the most loved in Britain. In fact, at this point, and for decades to come yet, snooker would comfortably be the much more popular and widespread billiards' little brother. As the historian Richard Holt points out in his book Sport and the British, it was only in 1936 that the major national newspaper, the Daily Mail, backed snooker over billiards, and initial competition in the years after 1875 was sparse. It took until the following decade before the game was even played at all in England, and there was no real competition or proper codification until the late 1910s. The following years after that saw the game grow slightly, with the Amateur Snooker Championship as well as the Midlands and Welsh Professional Championship matches taking place in subsequent years. Attempts were made for the first time in 1924 to form an open professional championship, but the game's overseers were less keen. The suggestion will receive consideration at an early date, said Billiards Association and Control Council Secretary A. Stanley Thorne. But it seems a little doubtful whether snooker, as a spectacular game, is sufficiently popular to warrant the successful promotion of such a competition. Despite this, there was a growing sense of inevitability that the cue sports authorities would cede to the pressure. One of those who was persistent in his attempts to campaign for the championship was a Mr. Bill Camkin of Birmingham. He helped to produce a rule book for snooker, working with the Midland Counties Billiards Association to cement the game's regulations. As someone who was heavily involved in cue sports, as I will later discuss in far more detail, he was conscious of billiards' growing pitfalls. He sensed the game was beginning to lose its popularity, with players like star Australian Walter Lindrum starting to score too highly under current rules. Not someone to sit on the sidelines, he began campaigning for changes. And a magic partnership with a rising cueist from Chesterfield named Joe Davis would prove the trick. The pair had met a few years earlier at the 1921 Midland Professional Billiard Championship held in Chesterfield. The following year, Camkin had hosted Davis and fellow player Fred Lawrence at his rooms in Birmingham for the semi-final and final of the second-class Professional Billiards Championship. Davis and Camkin shared a vision that a professional championship could become reality, and their draft proposal got the crucial BA and CC backing to go ahead in 1927. 4 different venues in the UK would carry the burden of the first tournament. Thurston's Hall in Leicester Square, pictured here on the left, the Lord Nelson Hotel in Nottingham, Cable Street Billiards Hall in Liverpool, and Camkin's own rooms on John Bright Street, Birmingham, pictured here in the modern day on the right. The nature of this first tournament was quite different to that which we might be familiar with now. The entry fee was around 5 guineas, roughly £5 in today's money. And as snooker journalist Clive Everton has commented in his book, The History of Snooker and Billiards, winner Joe Davis's prize money was repurposed to buy a trophy that still lasts to this day. This is compared to the £500,000 which the winner of this year's World Snooker Championship, Luca Brissell, took home. The early variation of this tournament also played so-called dead frames. These are frames played after which victory has already been determined. To think that now some fans complain about the slow play of some of snooker's leading stars. Reaction to this debut event was, on the whole, positive. A correspondent from the Observer newspaper, writing before the tournament, remarked that there was a keener competitive spirit than before in billiards and its associated games. The brand-spangled new game of snooker had proved to be, in his words, an additional public attraction. There were concerns over the format, particularly that of dead frames, but the decision to include them was clearly a commercial one, about providing a decent amount of action for punters. The intrigue of this new game was, however, undoubted. As the correspondent also commented, snooker was a test of a player's all-round knowledge of the game, of which actual snookering, meaning potting, is not the least important. The tactical potential of the new variation was clear and enticing. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, given its apparent popularity, the event returned the following year. On this occasion, it was played on a challenge basis, with Davis automatically through to the final, whilst the rest of the field was whittled down to 1. 4 of the 6 matches were played in Birmingham, this time in Campkin's Corporation Street-based rooms, adjacent to the old Grand Theatre, which you can just about make out here. The final was also once again staged in Birmingham at these premises by Campkin. There was also a match played in nearby Leamington Spa, for what was, for many years, the British Legion building on Kenilworth Street. It is fair to say that in these early years, the tournament did not grow enormously. In fact, the first few editions struggled for entries, with only 5 participating in the 1929 competition and only 2 in 1931. Davis's dominance was perhaps both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it attracted punters familiar with the prowess of the sport's leading proprietor. On the other, it stymied competition and challenge. Between 1927 and 1946, Davis would go on to collect 15 World Snooker Championship titles, with no other player taking a title until Walter Donaldson in 1947. The early part of the 1930s, in Clive Everton's judgment, represented steady progress as rules began to be straightened out and popularity further increased. But whilst now the game of snooker, never mind the World Championship, is very much associated with one place, things could not have been more different in the late 1920s and onwards. In fact, the World Snooker Championship final would have 19 different homes after leaving Campkin's in 1928, before its move to the Crucible 46 years ago. This, as I mentioned earlier, included a return to Birmingham in 1972, when Alex Higgins took the first of his 2 world titles at the British Legion Club in Selly Park. Now, I have no doubt that it is partly this discordant start to the World Championship's life that has led to the tournament's early years becoming a bit unloved in memory. The tournament I have described is quite dissimilar to the one which takes place today, a truly global affair. And in so many ways, snooker as a sport was made in the 1980s, when it rivaled even the national sport of football for attention, column inches, and interest. But without these humble beginnings, the leap may never have been taken to launch the event and pivot cue sports further towards snooker. It is no wonder that the event's organiser, Mr. Bill Campkin, has been described by more than one person to me as the Barry Hearn of his time. Like Hearn, the successful sports promoter who ran the Matchroom snooker stable in the 1980s and has played a key role in the sports of boxing and darts, Campkin had the courage of his convictions. Some may have opted for a safer route, sticking with the already popular billiards. But sensing both an appetite for something different and an opportunity for new growth, Camkin seized at the chance to host a first World Snooker Championship. In doing so, Camkin unknowingly laid the seeds for nearly a century of competition and growth in interest. So who was this plucky snooker promoter from Birmingham? Well, Bill Camkin, full name William Alexander Camkin, was born in London in 1894. He originated from the northern part of the city, in Kensal Rise. It was there he began his long career in the billiards trade. He had shown early promise in youth as a goalkeeper, playing with prestigious junior clubs in London before injury cut his career short. He turned to refereeing, serving as a Class 1 official. As far as billiards was concerned, he first worked for the successful company Burroughs and Watts, based on Soho Square in London, a place where Bill would develop and kindle his passion for the billiards industry. Burroughs and Watts are a prestigious billiard table, cue and accessory manufacturer, first established in 1836. A visionary in the business, they were at the vanguard of many of the key technical developments in billiards, helping, for example, to introduce vulcanized rubber on cushions to reduce the impact of temperature on the tables. It was also supposedly a Burroughs and Watts table which gave birth to the game of snooker devised by Colonel Sir Neville Chamberlain back in the late 1880s. The company also enjoyed a royal warrant from Queen Victoria. The perfect place, it seems, to serve your billiards and snooker apprenticeship. However, the extent of Camkin's involvement in the industry would not stop there. In 1920, aged just 26, Camkin moved north to Birmingham to set up his own independent trade. His first company was called Camkin Limited, trading from the John Bright Street premises on 7th Street corner. That first company would, however, be sold to competitors Orms, another prestigious billiard table manufacturer. The move, seemingly a bit of a backward step for the young and ambitious Camkin, can perhaps be put down to financial motivations. World War I had had a highly disruptive impact on the trade, stopping the import of essential materials as well as production. Whilst timber could be imported again after the armistice, global recession meant many businesses were struggling. A series of acquisitions and mergers duly followed. But even if this goes some way to explaining the end of Camkin's first independent business, it did not end his enterprise. A new company, Birmingham Billiards, would be established, with an office at 192 Corporation Street, just opposite the Law Courts, as well as the aforementioned halls just along the road, adjacent to the Grand Theatre. In addition to this, Camkin operated a number of halls both across the city and in the greater West Midlands region. There was a premises at 361 Witton Road, which, as you can see from this photo pictured, is distinguishably a billiard hall building today, even if it now serves an entirely different purpose for the local community. Camkin also traded at Dudley Road in nearby Oldbury and on Corporation Street in Stoke-on-Trent. Bill also helped to establish the Tudor Billiard Hall on Augusta Place in Leamington Spa, which was operated by player Fred Smith, who, as well as playing the game, had refereed the 1928 World Final in Camkin's Corporation Street rooms. Whilst Campkin's involvement in helping to host the World Championship would come to an end by 1930, his billiards and snooker trade continued for over 2 decades. When restrictions on the use of wood were enforced during and after the Second World War, he adapted his trade to the refurbishment of second-hand tables. Campkin would also be involved in some rather fantastic escapades away from these shores. For example, a tour to North America with the aforementioned Walter Lindrum. And it wasn't just other nations which Campkin visited. In 1931, Lindrum was invited, along with his promoter Campkin, to Buckingham Palace. The Australian was to get a very special royal seal of approval by being asked to give a performance for King George V and Queen Mary. As Andrew Ricketts details in his book Walter Lindrum Billiards Phenomenon, Campkin received initial communications from the King's private secretary, Sir Derek Keppel. Buckingham Palace requested that the event be kept a secret, partly due to the King's indifferent health. Campkin even initially kept the news secret from Lindrum himself, before divulging the news that Lindrum would be making an appearance at the palace on the 19th of February 1931 over a cup of coffee. The news was so significant that it kept Lindrum awake that very night. The preparations and practice for this event would be notably discreet, and the Australian worked meticulously on tightening up his trick shots for the occasion. The pair then headed to London on the morning of the 19th, arranged a scheduled match as normal, and then remarkably caught a taxi to the palace. There, they had to contend with a bemused driver who refused to drive in onto the grounds past the gates. It was only when a detective arrived, who assured him all was well, that he finally did so, before Lindrum and Campkin were escorted out of the vehicle. Ricketts describes the billiard room the pair were soon escorted into as appropriately palatial, the panelled walls matching the mahogany table, the cloth olive green with matching pocket nets, and the chandelier an ornate bronze. When His and Her Majesties arrived shortly afterwards, the King regaled Lindrum with his detailed knowledge of the latest billiards events, helping to put his rather unsteady nerves at ease. As well as billiards and snooker, Bill Campkin also enjoyed a highly successful career in football administration. He joined the board of Birmingham City FC in 1938 and later rose to become the first managing director in the Football League. It was arguably this role which gained him the most local notoriety, something indicated in a series of cartoons from the famous Birmingham illustrator Norman Edwards. This wasn't the first time that Edwards had depicted Campkin, as this Evening Dispatch cartoon from November 1926 indicates, and I'm happy to share some of these images with you all afterwards the talk. There was also this one from April 1932, featured in the Birmingham Gazette, not long after Bill Campkin had returned from his tour in Canada and the United States. But in the cartoon depicted here, we see Edwards show Joe Davis and fellow player Horace Lindrum playfully question Campkin's new role in football, saying they originally thought they had been signed to play for a billiards promoter. A Campkin figure jokes that he is instead an Arsenal director, what I assume must be a pun on the common cannon shot. Either way, Campkin was a famous figure locally as he helped to steer Birmingham City through these years, which included the difficult period of the Second World War, when he was secretary manager. He also applied the ambition and vision he held for Q Sports to football, pushing for changes to regulations on transfer expenditures, as well as league promotion and relegation systems. He was also an early proponent for a Football League Cup competition, as was later adopted and created. On the former matter, one thinks his fiscal responsibility would be useful in today's football landscape. Crucially on the pitch, however, he was a key individual in helping to turn the club's fortunes around. In 1939, the club were relegated from the First Division after 19 consecutive seasons there, and in January 1942, a disastrous fire ripped through the stadium's grandstand, dressing rooms and other buildings. The club would, however, recover both from the fire and the poor form, returning to the First Division in 1948 after a Second World War-induced suspension of the Football League. After again dropping to the Second Division, the club returned to the top flight for the 1955-56 season, when they finished 6th and reached the final of the FA Cup. Sadly, whilst Campkin did see that record high placing, he died just 10 days before the final, where the Blues were defeated 3-1 by Manchester City. That is a final the football fans amongst you may recall, famous for seeing Man City's goalkeeper, Bert Trautmann, play the last 15 minutes with a broken neck. In later years, having moved first to the Cotswolds, he then relocated to Avenue Road, Leamington, where he lived with his wife and 2 sons, John and Bob. His son Bob would join the billiards and snooker industry in around 1952, and Bill Campkin's business interests also turned to the hotel trade. He opened a hotel in the town, the Spa Hotel on Holly Walk, but sadly died in 1956, aged 61, around 3 years after setting it up. It and the billiards business was then taken up by his son, Bob, before the hotel was later sold and the billiards business acquired by Riley's of Accrington in 1961. Bill Campkin's death in 1956 was mourned widely, both in Birmingham, the West Midlands and further afield. Joe Davis was reported to say, "This is a very great blow, for Bill Campkin was one of my closest and dearest friends. We have been very close to one another since he introduced me to the professional snooker game some 35 years ago. It was largely through him that a snooker championship was ever begun, so it can truly be said that it was he who helped to make me a champion, and for that I must ever be grateful." It was not only Bill's son Bob who continued the family involvement in sport. His other son, John, became a reputable sports journalist and administrator. He was a frequent commentator on BBC Radio, covering the 1954, 58 and 62 World Cups, before later working on ITV's coverage of the 1966 World Cup, as well as for Anglia Television. In addition to this, he worked on Fleet Street as a reporter, first for the News Chronicle, under the tutelage of the famous and admired footballer turned writer Charlie Buchan, and then the Daily Mail. Later, he became involved in the travel agency industry, developing a small chain later bought by Thompson's. He also became highly involved in the realms of football management and directorship. He served as a director of Coventry City FC and was key to persuading Jimmy Hill to join the club as manager. In his time at the club, the Sky Blues rose from the bottom of the 3rd Division to the 1st Division, qualifying for European competition for the first time in their history. He even played a part in devising the Sky Blue song, an anthem sung by the fans before every match. Along with Hill and business partner Olaf Dixon, he also ventured out to Saudi Arabia to help develop the game in the nation. Again, a family ahead of the curve. And the final driving passion of John's life proved to be the League Managers Association, now well known in the game as the trade union for English football managers. Campkin first became involved in the then Football League Secretaries and Managers Association, along with Dixon, in 1979. It was based out of Holly Walk in Leamington, where his father and then brother had operated the Spa Hotel. Sadly, John died in 1998. His colleague, Olaf Dixon, continued to be a key figure in the directorship of the organisation until his retirement in 2019. Like his father, John was too keenly interested in matters of the game. The League Managers Association, as it would become, was crucial in many ways. Firstly, it was created in a year, 1992, in which the very structures of the game were transforming with the launch of the Premier League. But it also aimed to create a more fit-for-purpose body for the representation and advocacy of managers, as opposed to the previous organisation, which had functioned on a limited and part-time basis. Much earlier, as a sports journalist, his book World Cup 1958 produced an account both of that famous tournament and a series of suggestions for improvement to the game, many of which were taken up. It all adds up to a significant personal contribution to the game of football between John and his father Bill. Now, our journey so far has taken us far and wide, from Buckingham Palace to Saudi Arabia. But in the final part of today's talk, I would like to reground us in Birmingham, the city where all of this, of course, began. Sadly, its snooker lineage did not continue in any real significant way after the heady days of the 1920s and 30s. The last significant event to be held in the city was the 1982 Professional Players Tournament, which took place between the La Reserve in Sutton Coldfield and the International Snooker Club in Aston. It was the first tournament in a prestigious series which became known as the World Open and was won by Welsh star Ray Reardon. There have been some notable players from the city, for example Mitchell Mann and Graham Miles. The 12 times women's world champion Rhiannon Evans is also from nearby Dudley. But sadly, the city does not retain a significant role in the game of professional snooker today. As for the sites of the two halls which hosted the 1927 and 1928 finals, there is little indication they were ever of such significance to our story as they are today. The John Bright Street building is now a Brewdog pub with what I believe are original facades, though the street itself has changed immeasurably since the 1920s, as this picture that I took just a few months ago describes. The iconic Victoria pub and Alexandra Theatre remain, but many of the buildings have gone through several changes of ownership and purpose. And unlike in the 1920s, when it was a significant site of sporting action, with the Athletic Institute Gymnasium also up the road at the time, it is nothing of the like now. It would later become synonymous with the city's nightlife, helped by a series of legendary clubs like the Cedar Club and Barbarella's. As for the Corporation Street building, like the Grand Theatre it was adjacent to, it has long since been demolished. The area where the hall was is next to what is now the Square Shopping Centre, over the road from the Square Peg pub. No lasting reminder to the contribution these buildings made to the game of snooker, let alone the local area. Now, last year, perhaps like many of you, I was in the city for the highly successful Commonwealth Games. It was a sporting event of epic proportions, which brought the eyes of the world on Birmingham for just under 2 weeks. The atmosphere was undoubtedly fantastic, captivating locals and indeed the many visitors who came to Birmingham. And in many ways, it felt like a celebration both of Birmingham today and indeed its past. There was the use of the Smithfield site, formerly the home of one of the largest markets in Europe for beach volleyball and basketball, a clash of times and a clash of cultures. Indeed, there were also the opening and closing ceremonies, which, like their highly regarded London 2012 Olympic counterparts, sought to represent all parts of their city's heritage and identity. But I can't help but feel, looking back on these games, having conducted this project, tinged with regret. And as a side note, that is putting to one side the issues of finances exposed by the City Council's recent bankruptcy. I think a whole other debate for a whole other day, I'm sure you'd agree. For all of the Commonwealth Games' successes, and indeed its commitment to future growth and sustainability, how can it be that the major contributions like this are simply overlooked? Is a city really serving its heritage and history if it allows stories from its past to simply be lost to the perils of time? As for the game itself, snooker is a sport which prides itself on its heritage. Celebrating its past is indeed a part of its DNA, something punters buy into year on year when they attend the Crucible. Now, that may not last forever. In 2027, the contract for the Crucible Theatre to hold the World Championship comes to an end. It may be that the event leaves the city after 50 years, particularly as World Snooker looks to expand its horizons further afield in new markets such as the Middle East. But I am convinced that the sport could do even more to commemorate its past. And that could begin by some form of representation in Birmingham of what once was. To see a plaque on John Bright Street, where the hall which kicked off nearly 100 years of World Championship snooker belonged, would be a fitting homage to the city and a place which served the sport well. And it would also honour the sizable commitment of Bill Campkin, whose vision and tenacity to seize the opportunity snooker represented laid the seeds for all that was to come. It seems appropriate and right to finish this talk by reflecting once more on Campkin. There is a rather magical description of Bill in a Q Personalities feature in the Old Darts Weekly News. Like Napoleon, it says, he has drive and he has a strong vein of sagacity. Like Napoleon? Perhaps. But unlike the famous French emperor, he does not receive the level of commemoration that comes with being deemed one of history's great men. And Birmingham is a city which is very good at commemorating its great men. There are the Chamberlains, the Cadbury family, Matthew Boulton, so many people of sizable contributions, all regarded in some way or another. But as I hope this talk has demonstrated, you can now add to that another name, the Campkins, and a family which has too contributed so much to West Midlands life. I'm going to bring this talk to an end shortly. I will leave some time at the end for any questions, feedback or further comments people may have. But I would firstly like to thank some people. Alexander Campkin, the grandson of Bill, for being so kind as to share with me many of the great artefacts and clippings he has retained of his grandfathers, as well as being happy to answer my multitude of questions. I would also like to thank Irene Deboo, the organiser of the Birmingham Heritage Week, for being extremely accommodating with my talk and helping get this topic a wider audience. And also, again, Dave Hendon, who helped to sow the seeds for this talk, and I think shares with me the hope that there can be some better commemoration of this part of snooker's history in the future. And to anyone and everyone who has shared this talk, helped me with an inquiry, or attended today, thank you. I hope that there can continue to be research done on Birmingham and the West Midlands' association with snooker, and indeed wider sporting and social life. I am now going to leave you with a rather wonderful video which shows Bill Campkin introducing two of his players, Tom Newman, also of Birmingham, and Walter Lindrum, at an event in Thurston's Hall in Leicester Square, which I mentioned earlier on. Just bear with me one moment so I can ensure that the sound will work. Hopefully it can help to animate some of the stories I've presented today. And as I said, I'm happy to continue any discussions after it finishes. But for now, thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of Birmingham Heritage Week.
This narrow inlet is where Lieutenant Hobson sank the Merrimac.
This is the first occasion in the history of billiards that a sound film has been made as part of an important game. This is Walter Lindrum, and this is Tom Newman with his famous chin.
55, 58, 63, 65, 87, 89, 532 last break. 900. 3. 9. 25. 40. 58. 995.
Thank you again, everyone. Feel free to head off if you have other talks to do, or you might have other things going on in your day. But thank you for your attendance. Feel free to send me an email or drop me a line if you have any questions. Just seeing one there from Neil. Have you or has anyone else approached Brewdog or the owner of the building to put up a plaque? So the status with regards to the plaque is that I got in touch with the Birmingham Civic Society a few months ago and let them know about the project that I was doing and said, you know, what's the process for an application? I should stop recording actually, shouldn't I? People might not want to hear me rambling on like this. Um,